I'm Kent and you're watching Weekend Adventure Rides. This week we are taking on the XR250's rear shock. We're going to be rebuilding that with new seals, new fluid. We're going to do some cleaning, prep, and paint work. And we're going to get this thing looking brand new. Don't go anywhere. We're going to get started right now. All right, so I've got a vise set up on my work desk here, workbench. First thing we're gonna do is get this spring off here. So I'm probably gonna use a little brake clean or deep creep in there to try to break these loose before I go pound it on them with a hammer. All right, let's see if we can break this lock nut loose. All right, we'll take that lock nut all the way down. Now we're gonna go at this preload adjuster. All right, so we've got this lock nut and the preload tension adjuster as far as we can get them down. So what we're going to do is have to actually take the reservoir off. Now this is full of oil, so I have an oil pan down there on the ground to catch all of it as it comes out of here. The other thing is there's a cover over the top of this gas inlet outlet. I didn't want to do this, but it's not cooperating. There we go. All right, so we have access to the chamber now, and we're going to take off a little cap. It looks like this has never been off before. It's perfectly clean in there. Then we're going to release the gas out of it, and then we're going to pull that valve core. Okay, we got that out. Don't lose that part. I'm going to see if we can get this pushed down and then carefully get the oil out of this thing. I'm going to use a socket and a hammer, and we're just going to tap this thing down, see if it's going to move. And it is. We're almost down to the circlip there. There we go. So we'll remove that circlip. There we go. Got the circlip out. In order to get this out of here, I threaded the cap back on of the air inlet. And then I'm just going to grab it with these channel locks and pull it out so I don't damage the threads. There we go. Whew, that oil stinks. So there's the bladder and then the air inlet. Bladder actually looks to be in pretty good shape. I'm not going to replace that. All right, so we have access to the oil now. So we're going to get rid of the oil into this oil pan down here. I'm just going to dump that out. This is very dark old oil. Now we're going to take these banjo bolts out. I'm going to take the reservoir off, make sure we get all of the rest of the old oil out of there. And then we'll set that aside. I'm going to take this second banjo bolt out. All right, that should be far enough to get us there. Now when we turn this over, oil's going to come out of it, so I'm going to set it over the top of this oil pan, put it back in the vise. Okay, now we can get all of our retaining clips off here. Okay, so we got that one, the retainer, then this should just come right off, and then the spring will just come right off the top. Now we are going to pull this clip right here, not clip, but cover. We'll probably use a screwdriver or a punch and a hammer. All right, so got that little cover off. So I've got a zip tie. We'll use that to hold this little cover off. Now there's a circlip in here we have to get out. So we're going to push down on this a little bit so we can get past the point of that circlip. I can see it there. It's up against it right now. So we'll knock this down far enough to get the circlip out. Pretty easy. And then a combination of the pick and a screwdriver. There we go. Circlip is out. Now we should be able to just use this. Whoa, that was easier than I expected. So let's dump the rest of this out in the oil pan. We'll get this cleaned up. Now that we've got the shock body disassembled, we have the rod here that has the bolt on top that is actually going to need to be ground to remove. So we're going to use probably the Dremel tool, and we'll get in there and we'll grind that off so we can get this bolt pulled off. Now we're going to grind off the top of this rod here just so we can unscrew the bolt. Now you only want to take off as much metal as you absolutely have to. And so just be nice and careful with this as you're going. Okay, using a 17mm socket, we're going to turn this off here. All right, and we will be replacing that, so don't worry too much. Now, like everybody else, I'm just going to put a screwdriver on there and use that to take off all of the valves and all those washers. Now I'm going to leave those on there. We'll set them to the side because we're going to clean those up too. So this is the old head there. We're going to remove that and finish disassembling. All right, so we've got everything disassembled and we're going to put the new shock head seal in, but first we have to get everything cleaned up. So I'm going to get all the big pieces, put those into a bin, and then we're going to clean them up with a rag and also some other cleaning tools like brushes and things. Get everything shined up. So while I'm in there working on getting everything cleaned up, I am not crazy about the 90s colors that Honda picked, including purple. So we're going to get this, actually the paint removed off this, and we're going to paint it black. So I've got a little industrial strength paint stripper. We'll let that sit for 30. Hopefully that paint comes off there and we can get that repainted and it won't be purple anymore. All right, so I've allowed this paint stripper to work for about half an hour. Now we're gonna go after it with just a wire brush real quick and see how well it comes off or how easily. Actually fairly easy. But I think it'll be a lot easier with power tools. So let's switch over to power tools. Oh yeah, that's butter. All right, so I've got the spring here all cleaned up and all that purple paint off there. And now we are going to spray it down with some metal prep, along with a few other pieces that I've cleaned up off of the shock body. And we're gonna get those painted with this, but just a little metal prep. So the paint's gonna stick to it a little bit better. All right, so I've allowed a day for the chemical etch to dry. Now I'm gonna use some isopropyl alcohol and a clean rag, also some gloves, and we're gonna wipe down all these parts that we're gonna paint right now. Okay, so we're gonna do 2 light coats and then a medium coat of this roll bar and chassis paint from VHT. I believe I got this one online, but you can get these at most auto parts stores. It really seems to be one of the brands that's carried at like O'Reilly's. All right, so we've got the shock all cleaned up. Now there's just one last thing we need to do before we can start reassembling everything, and that's replace this bearing here at the top. So we're gonna put this shock body in the vise and we're gonna get a new bearing put in there. All right, using a screwdriver, I'm just gonna pop these seals out. There's a circlip on one side, it looks like, so we're gonna push the other way. And I just need to find a couple sockets that fit this. So what we're gonna do is use a socket that is the same diameter as the race on this bearing. So that will work right there. And then we're gonna use a socket that's larger than the whole bearing itself that's gonna go on the other side. So this bearing will push the, or this socket will push the bearing through and into this other socket. So make sure we're pushing it the right way because, like I said, there's a circlip on here. You can't really push through that. Ooh, nailed it. So we're just gonna use the vise to start working that bearing out. All right, and we have the bearing out. So now we'll clean out the space where this bearing is going to go back in, the new one anyway. And we've got a new bearing here. Came with our linkage rebuild kit. Okay, I'm just going to use a little bit of assembly lube to do this. Put it on the inside of that race there. And then a little bit on the bearing itself. And then we'll make sure we line this up really well. Okay, that looks really even. Start pushing on it. And we're going to push on it until it gets all the way up against that circlip. All right, so that's seated all the way. So we're going to put our new caps in there with the new seals. Now we are ready to reassemble this shock. We've got the shock shaft in the vise, and now we are going to get started exactly what items need to go in there and in the correct order. Okay, so the first piece is this little retainer here that holds the bump stop. So that's going to go on first, and then our rubber bottom out stop or bump stop. Next will be the cap cover for the shock body. And then we will have our new seal head. This is a Tusk seal head. So we're going to put some shock oil on that and get that on there. But first, make sure that you use your Tusk shock shaft bullet. And that just goes on there like this. That way you're not causing any damage to this the sealing surfaces on this seal head. We'll get a little bit of shock oil or shock fluid and put it in the cap, just so we can use it to help lubricate everything. We don't want to cause any damage to any of these surfaces or mating surfaces here. Okay, and then this is going to go with the leading seal down. Okay, now we're going to get our two shim stacks on and our valve. We'll remove the seal bullet. Begin slipping all those little washers and shims on. Okay, we're going to lubricate up this valve here. That'll go on a little bit easier. And then the rest of our shims. Okay, so we're going to put the new lock nut on there, and I'm going to use some Loctite to make sure it stays. So doing a little bit more research, I was able to find some of the torque specifications that I left out earlier in the video. The damper lock nut needs to be torqued to 21 foot-pounds, and then the banjo bolts, those are torqued to 25 foot-pounds. Okay, so we are torqued down. We'll peen this so that it doesn't come apart. Just got a little punch and a hammer, and we'll do a couple. Okay, so we have our reservoir. We're going to put our valving in. So we've got our compression adjuster put in, and I just use a 19mm open end wrench to get that all the way in there and kind of torque down. But you can see there's two peen marks on both sides of this where it looks like it's from the factory actually, where this was set to. So I've got that little set screw at the top, or excuse me, that little set screw lines up perfectly with the bottom there, that casting mark. So we've got that all the way in. Now I know that this hose that goes between is going to sit just like that. It's perfectly lined up with the shock body or the reservoir body. Line up our hose there, and then our bolt through. Put our reservoir body in the vise, and then we're going to just tighten this down here, the banjo bolt. Okay, that's pretty good there. Everything's lined up. Okay, now we can reattach this to the shock body itself. So this is going to be angled a bit, kind of off this way. So we'll line it up like that. All right, just like before, we use one of those crush washers, the copper ones, and then the tube and another crush washer and our banjo bolt. So we've got our shock body reattached to our reservoir. We're going to get the shock body in the vise, and we're going to fill that up with some fluid. And we have our drain, our oil container down here, because this is going to make a huge mess. So we'll push our piston and then head seal in. until we can get our circlip on. Okay, looks good. So we'll pull up on this, make sure it's seated all the way. There we go. Okay, we've got our bladder connected to the top of our reservoir. And so we are going to fill the rest of the reservoir up with our shock fluid. It's probably too much. Anyway, we don't want any air bubbles in there, so too much is okay. Now we're going to slip our reservoir in, and you're going to watch shock fluid spill all over the place. But we're going to want to... I don't have the valve core in this intentionally because this is going to compress as we push it in there. There's all of our shock fluid. And we're going to press that in until we can get the circlip in. Okay. Then we're going to put our circlip in. So I've got my valve stem tool. We're going to get our valve stem tightened all the way back down. And now we're going to put a little bit of, well, we're going to put a little air in there just using a bike pump. So you're not supposed to use an air compressor to do this, but I can't find a bike pump and I just don't care. This should work just fine. This is a 12-volt pump that I use for my Suzuki in case I get a flat tire. But it should work fine. And that worked. Just popped it straight up and seated it against the circlip. Okay, now we're going to put our dust seal back on and we'll tap that back in there. All right, so here we have our finished spring, which is now black and no longer purple, thank goodness. So we're gonna go ahead and put this on there. There are actually two sides to this spring. I mean, obviously, but this one's smaller, this one's larger. The larger one is gonna go to the top in this case. So we'll put the lower ring on and we'll push this bump stop all the way down so we can get this ring on here. And once that's on, then we can lift up on that bump stop and it'll fit right through. There we go. Now we can get this thing tightened up. I'm just gonna push up on the spring and then bring up our lock nuts here. So now we gotta set the spring length, and I'm gonna do that according to the book and set it to the standard length. So we are going to continue tightening this spring down. There we go, right at 8 inches. So that looks good. And we will take the locking nut, spin that up, get that set. Okay, and then just using a screwdriver, I'm gonna lock this in place. I don't need it overly tight. Okay, we are finished up with this build and we've freshened up this rear shock, put new seals in it as well as new fluid, and repainted it, cleaned it up. It's ready to go on this bike. Now, if you have any questions about how to do this, feel free to drop the questions down in the comment section. I'm usually pretty quick about responding to those. Additionally, one last thing that you need to do with this shock is have it nitrogen charged. Now, it gets charged to 284 PSI. I wouldn't recommend putting just regular air in there because it has a potential to explode, and nitrogen being an inert gas, it won't do that. So take it to a local mechanic shop that does rebuilds for suspensions, and they should be able to do it for you. There's a shop here in town that I'm gonna use and have them do it for me. Don't forget, like, subscribe, follow us along because we've got so much more to do for this bike build, and we will see you next week.